Imagine voluntarily handing over like 1,900 nuclear weapons.
Right.
I mean, you possess the third largest nuclear arsenal on the entire planet. You give up the absolute ultimate guarantee of your nation's survival, and in exchange, you get a signed promise on a piece of paper from the world's superpowers.
Just a piece of paper.
Exactly. What happens when, 30 years later, the political leaders who are supposed to honor that paper decide they just don't like you anymore?
Welcome to the Impeach 47 podcast. In today's deep dive into our reporting, we are dropping all neutrality to expose the systemic corruption, authoritarian loyalties, and outright lies shaping global security.
Because it is, frankly, an incredibly dangerous moment in global politics right now. When you look at the raw data compared to the narratives being pushed at the highest levels of American politics, we aren't just seeing a difference of opinion. We are tracking a deliberate, calculated distortion of facts designed specifically to serve an authoritarian agenda. Yeah, and we're going to give you a clear roadmap for how we unpack this today. First, we're going to systematically dismantle Donald Trump's fabricated claims about United States aid to Ukraine.
Right, the financial lies.
Because our reporting exposes the personal grudges and the Vladimir Putin loyalties that are actually driving his rhetoric. And then we're going to pivot to the battlefield reality our research has uncovered on the ground, which is Ukraine's recent devastating drone strikes deep inside the Ural Mountains.
And the genuinely absurd cover-ups deployed by Russian officials to hide the damage from their own people.
Yeah. So the place we absolutely have to start is the mathematical fiction being broadcast to the American public. Donald Trump has repeatedly and aggressively told the world that Joe Biden gave Ukraine $350 billion.
Which is just an astronomical number.
He uses that massive, terrifying number to frame U.S. aid as this unbearable domestic burden, and he explicitly claims that this financial support is one of the reasons the war continues.
Wait, I need to jump in and stop you right there because I want to play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
Let's look at the actual numbers. According to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, which is, the gold standard for tracking this stuff.
Right, absolutely.
The real total U.S. commitment since February 2022 is approximately $175 billion. Now, $175 billion is literally half of what Trump claims.
Half?
Right. But if you're an American taxpayer looking at your paycheck, $175 billion is still like a massive amount of money.
It is a massive sum. But we have to break down what that number actually represents, because the deception isn't just about doubling the top-line figure. It's a fundamental misrepresentation of the mechanics of foreign aid. Out of that $175 billion, we're looking at roughly $67 billion for military assistance, $32 billion for economic support, and $23 billion for humanitarian aid.
And this is where the public narrative completely derails. If you are reading these headlines, the natural assumption is that the United States is essentially acting as a giant ATM, right?
Yeah, just wiring billions of dollars in cash directly to Kiev.
Exactly. But when we actually trace these appropriations, where do those dollars actually land? Because our research shows they absolutely aren't just leaving the country.
No, they aren't. And this is the most critical structural reality of the U.S. defense economy. The vast majority of these funds never leave the United States.
Never leave.
Right. Our findings, which are backed by extensive analysis from Lawfare and the Congressional Research Service, document that these appropriations function primarily as domestic industrial investments.
Yeah.
They subsidize American defense manufacturers. We've actually tracked this money flowing directly into production facilities across at least 31 different states and 71 different cities.
Okay, let me see if I have this mechanism right. When a headline says the U.S. is sending $1 billion in military aid, we aren't sending $1 billion. We are taking older existing weapon systems from U.S. military stockpiles, things that were built like decades ago, and shipping that hardware to Ukraine. Then the Department of Defense uses the newly appropriated $1 billion to pay American corporations, utilizing American workers, to build modernized, state-of-the-art replacements for the U.S. military.
That is exactly how the defense replenishment mechanism operates. It acts as a massive revitalization program for the American defense industrial base.
Yeah.
A comprehensive analysis by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, or CEPR, looked deeply into this.
Right.
And they found that once you account for the domestic economic activity these dollars generate, so The expansion of manufacturing lines, the supply chain logistics contracts, the localized tax revenues in these 71 cities, the real cost to the U.S. taxpayer is actually less than half of the official headline figure.
Wow. So it's essentially an industrial subsidy disguised as an outbound foreign aid bill. So the $350 billion claim isn't just mathematically false. It relies on the public not understanding how the military-industrial procurement cycle works at all.
Precisely. But there's another layer to this deception that's equally damaging. The rhetoric out of Trump's camp consistently implies that the United States is carrying the entire global burden alone. He paints this picture of Washington being taken advantage of by the rest of the world.
Which our reporting shows is just demonstrably false. I was looking at the Kiel Institute data, and it completely shatters this solitary savior myth.
It really does.
The European Union institutions and their member states have together committed approximately 165.7 billion euros in support to Ukraine since 2022. They are heavily outpacing U.S. commitments.
They are. And what is vital to understand is how Europe reacted when American political dysfunction actually threatened to collapse the Ukrainian defense. In 2025, specifically to compensate for Washington's abdication after Trump allies halted U.S. military aid, European military support surged by 67% above their previous averages.
So Europe did not wait for Washington to sort out its internal politics.
Not at all.
They saw the vacuum created by American instability and actively stepped in to fill it.
Exactly. When you look at EU-level financial and humanitarian aid today, it accounts for nearly 90% of all non-military international support. The United States was never carrying this alone. Framing it that way is a calculated lie designed to build resentment among the American electorate.
So if we know the math doesn't support the $350 billion narrative, and we know the burden-sharing arguments are complete fictions, we have to ask the ultimate question.
Right.
Why push the lie?
Yeah, if the U.S. is signaling a withdrawal of support based on inflated numbers, what is the actual underlying motive?
Well, the motive is not rooted in strategic grand strategy or national security policy. As our reporting repeatedly highlights, the motive is a deep-seated personal vendetta, which is fundamentally compounded by a demonstrable years-long track record of subservience to Moscow.
And before we get into the specifics of that personal grudge, I want to pull back and look at the geopolitical history. Yes.
Because framing this support as, generosity run amok completely erases the legal and moral obligations of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. For anyone listening who isn't a historian of nuclear nonproliferation, how crucial is this document?
The Budapest Memorandum is the foundational context for every geopolitical move happening in Eastern Europe today. In 1994, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine suddenly found itself possessing the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal.
Right.
We are talking about over 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads stationed on their soil.
Over 1,900 strategic warheads. That is an unimaginable amount of destructive power. To put that in perspective, that's enough nuclear yield to end human civilization several times over.
And they agreed to give them up. They transferred that entire arsenal to Russia for dismantlement, but they didn't do it blindly. In exchange for surrendering the ultimate strategic deterrent, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia signed a formal memorandum guaranteeing Ukraine's territorial integrity and political independence.
And the U.S. pushed for this, right?
Yeah, strongly. The U.S. actively pressured Ukraine to accept this deal to prevent global nuclear proliferation.
So Ukraine honored their end of the contract. They completely disarmed.
They did. And then Russia flagrantly breached the agreement with the 2014 annexation of Crimea and proceeded to shred it entirely with the full-scale invasion in 2022. By supplying weapons to Ukraine now, the United States is not handing out charity. It is honoring a signed historical security guarantee.
But by pretending this is just a massive cash drain, Trump is actively trying to erase a pivotal moment in nuclear nonproliferation history. And here's where it gets incredibly dark. You cannot separate his current willingness to abandon this treaty from the events of 2019.
Right.
This is where the personal grudge overrides national security.
You're referring to his first impeachment.
I am. Let's walk through that timeline because it explains exactly why Trump holds this profound animosity toward Volodymyr Zelensky. Take us back to the infamous July 25th, 2019 phone call. What actually happened?
So in the summer of 2019, Donald Trump was unilaterally withholding congressionally appropriated military aid to Ukraine aid that had already been approved and was desperately needed for their defense against ongoing Russian aggression in the Donbass.
Right. People forget there was already a war happening there.
Exactly. And he used that withheld aid as direct leverage to extort President Zelensky. During that July 25th call, Trump explicitly demanded that Zelensky publicly announce a fabricated investigation into Joe Biden and his son Hunter, who were, of course, Trump's primary domestic political rivals at the time.
So let's be crystal clear about the mechanism of that corruption. He was using taxpayer-funded military aid, designated to counter a hostile foreign adversary, as a hostage to demand foreign interference in an American democratic election.
Yes, and Zelensky refused to play along. He refused to provide the manufactured political dirt Trump was demanding. That refusal, and the subsequent whistleblower exposure of the phone call, led directly to Trump's first impeachment on charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress.
So in Trump's mind, Zelensky is the man who wouldn't play ball.
Oh, absolutely.
That refusal resulted in a permanent historical stain on Trump's presidency. When we look at his current rhetoric undercutting Zelensky at every turn, dismissing Ukraine's cause and eventually suspending aid in March 2025, it isn't a strategic pivot. It is an anti-democratic vendetta dressed up as a foreign policy platform.
It's entirely impossible to analyze his geopolitical actions without that psychological context. But even the grudge alone doesn't fully explain his sheer structural alignment with Russian state interests. We have to connect the vendetta against Ukraine to his broader, very public allegiance to Vladimir Putin.
Right. And if we're talking about allegiance to Putin, we have to talk about the 2018 Helsinki summit.
Okay.
Because for our reporting, that was the moment the subtext just became text.
The Helsinki summit remains one of the most stark, unprecedented examples of an American leader subordinating national interest to a foreign adversary. Standing on a global stage right beside Putin, Trump was asked directly about Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election.
Yeah.
And in front of the world's cameras, he publicly sided with the Russian president over his own American intelligence agencies. He explicitly stated that he found Putin's extremely strong and powerful denial to be credible, entirely dismissing the consensus of the U.S. intelligence community.
I remember David Gergen, the former presidential advisor, said it best, and we quoted him heavily in our research. He noted that Trump sided again and again against his own country's interests, and that pattern has only accelerated since Helsinki.
It is deeply accelerated. Think about the timeline. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, an unprovoked, horrific violation of international law, Trump went on television and publicly called the move smart.
Yeah, he praised Putin as a genius.
A genius for taking a massive piece of land for $2 worth of sanctions, I think is how he put it. He has continually echoed Russian state propaganda that tries to frame Ukraine as the aggressor. He has proposed rewarding Russian military conquest with permanent land swaps, and he utilized his political leverage to block aid.
So when Trump gets up on a stage today and claims that American aid is the reason the war continues, he is literally inverting cause and effect. The war continues because an authoritarian state invaded a sovereign democratic nation.
Precisely. And we have to be clear about the terminology here.
Yeah.
Cutting off a democratic nation's ability to defend itself against an unprovoked invasion does not bring peace. It brings surrender.
Right.
It guarantees the violent erasure of Ukrainian sovereignty. And it provides a verified, globally successful model for any dictator who wants to conquer a neighboring state.
Which brings us perfectly to the battlefield reality on the ground right now.
Sure.
Because while domestic politicians in the U.S. try to force a Ukrainian surrender through financial extortion and fake numbers, Ukraine is absolutely refusing to surrender.
Refusing.
In fact, our reporting shows they are taking the fight deep into Russian territory to systematically dismantle the Russian war machine from the inside out. Let's look at the incredible operational shift we saw with the April drone strikes.
The capabilities demonstrated by the Security Service of Ukraine's Special Operations Center, Alpha, specifically on April 29th and April 30th of 2026, represent a massive strategic evolution in this conflict. They are no longer just defending the front line, they are striking the deep logistical arteries of the Russian state.
I was looking at the satellite imagery of these targets, and what struck me was the precision. These were not random acts of retaliation. Walk us through what they actually hit.
So on the night of April 29th, Ukrainian long-range drones successfully penetrated Russian airspace and struck the Perm LPDS. This is a highly critical pumping station integrated into the Transneft pipeline network.
Okay.
It's responsible for storing and distributing massive quantities of oil through Russia's primary trunk pipeline system. Reports and visual evidence indicate that most of the facility's major storage tanks caught fire, severely degrading their distribution capacity.
And what's incredible is that they didn't just hit them once and retreat. They went right back into the same airspace 24 hours later.
The very next night, April 30th, The drones returned. But this time, the target was the Lukoil Perm Synthes oil refinery. To understand why this matters, you have to realize this is one of Russia's most technologically advanced refining facilities. It alone processes nearly 13 million tons of crude oil every single year.
13 million tons, but they didn't just bomb the perimeter, did they? They hit a very specific, highly vulnerable piece of engineering.
Right.
Explain the AVT4 unit, because the physics of how a refinery works is crucial to understanding why this strike was so devastating.
Okay, an oil refinery isn't just a collection of random holding tanks. It operates sequentially. When you bring in raw, unrefined crude oil, you have to separate it into usable fuels like diesel, aviation fuel, and gasoline. That separation process begins in the primary atmospheric and vacuum distillation towers.
Right.
The AVT4 unit is that primary distillation component. It is the physical bottleneck of the entire facility.
So if you destroy that specific tower, you basically choke off the rest of the plant.
Exactly. If you achieve a direct hit on the AVT4, which the Ukrainian drones did, causing it to ignite upon impact, you completely paralyze the entire refining process. The secondary catalytic crackers and reforming units downstream suddenly have zero feedstock to process. You don't have to destroy the entire massive complex. You just surgically remove the primary unit, and the facility is completely out of operation.
It is brilliant tactical engineering, but we also have to talk about the geography of these strikes, because the location of Perm fundamentally alters the strategic calculus of the war. How far into Russian territory are we actually talking about?
Perm is situated deep inside the Ural Mountains. We are talking about a target that is well over 1,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border.
1,500.
Yeah. For the vast majority of this conflict, the Russian military and political elite have operated under the comfortable assumption that their eastern industrial and energy base was completely immune to attack.
They thought distance was their ultimate shield.
They did. But as the SSU stated perfectly after the operation, distance no longer guarantees protection. Ukraine is sending a deliberate, undeniable signal to Moscow that the safe rear simply no longer exists.
But here is where the story takes a turn into the truly bizarre. I want to highlight the sheer, insulting absurdity of the authoritarian cover-up in the aftermath of these strikes, because it perfectly mirrors the kind of systemic lying we were just discussing regarding the U.S. political rhetoric.
Oh, man. What is endlessly fascinating and deeply disturbing is how a rigid, corrupt state apparatus responds when undeniable physical reality directly contradicts their carefully curated narrative of invulnerability.
Yeah.
You have a massive advanced refinery actively burning. You have a facility that processes 13 million tons of crude engulfed in flames. And yet the Perm region governor, Dmitry Makonin, immediately goes public and claims there is no significant damage.
No significant damage. It's almost comical. I'm looking at the verified video uploaded by local residents. There are massive plumes of thick, black industrial smoke dominating the entire city skyline. Anyone with eyes can see the facility is heavily damaged, but the state's instinct is to just demand the citizens reject their own reality.
It is the ultimate authoritarian reflex. Deny the reality directly in front of the public's eyes. But Governor Makonin's lie about the structural damage pales in comparison to the cover-up regarding the chemical emergency alert. That is where the deception crosses into outright farce.
Right. Break down the official state explanation for what happened with the chemical alert, because it genuinely sounds like something out of a bad dystopian novel.
Well, at almost the exact moment the Ukrainian drones successfully bypassed air defenses and impacted the industrial zone in Perm on April 30th, a citywide chemical emergency alert was instantly triggered.
Yeah.
Emergency sirens began blaring relentlessly across the city.
Right.
Residents started flooding social channels, reporting a very distinct sharp chemical odor in the air, and there was highly visible white smoke rapidly rising from the impact area.
Okay, so let's summarize the scene. We have emergency sirens, a choking chemical odor, and massive plumes of smoke, all perfectly synchronized to the exact minute of a confirmed foreign drone strike on a major oil refinery. How on earth did Russian officials explain that to the terrified public?
The authorities acknowledged that the sirens went off, but they released an official statement claiming it was merely a scheduled test.
A scheduled test?
Yes, a scheduled test that just magically coincidentally happened to align down to the absolute second with a high-explosive drone detonating inside their primary vacuum distillation unit.
Unbelievable.
The authorities blatantly refused to offer any explanation for the timing, the source of the chemical odor, or the smoke. They simply released the statement and fully expected the population to swallow the fabrication without question.
Just a scheduled test, folks. Nothing to see here. Ignore the burning distillation tower. It is a profound display of institutional weakness. When a government has to resort to lies that transparent and that ridiculous, it shows you exactly how fragile their hold on reality actually is. And honestly, it connects directly back to the exact theme we opened this deep dive with today.
It absolutely does. The mechanics of authoritarianism are surprisingly consistent, whether you are looking at domestic American politics or the Russian state.
Exactly. Whether it's Donald Trump lying about a $350 billion aid package to manufacture domestic outrage and cover for his loyalty to Vladimir Putin, or a Russian regional governor lying about a burning oil refinery to cover for the catastrophic failures of his own military's air defenses, authoritarianism relies on a single premise.
Demanding that people disbelieve their own lies.
Right? Demanding they ignore verifiable data and blindly accept the official fiction.
Which brings us to the chilling long-term implication that bridges both halves of our reporting today. If you are a vulnerable nation watching all this unfold, you are learning a terrifying lesson. In 1994, a democratic nation voluntarily gave up 1,900 nuclear warheads. They handed over the absolute ultimate guarantee of their own physical survival in exchange for a binding security promise from the United States.
And now, an American political leader is actively trying to abandon them. He is more than willing to discard that historic, legally binding non-proliferation promise over a petty, personal political grudge from 2019, and he is actively aligning himself with the invading dictator. If you are watching this from Taiwan or South Korea or anywhere in Eastern Europe,
What does that signal to you?
it sends a devastating, destabilizing message. It tells every vulnerable nation on Earth that American geopolitical promises are entirely worthless. It proves that international treaties and memorandums, the very foundation of global security, can be voided overnight by the personal whims and grudges of a corrupt leader.
It tells them that the only true security guarantee you can actually rely on, the only way to genuinely ensure your sovereign borders are respected by an authoritarian neighbor, is to build your own nuclear arsenal. By turning his back on the Budapest Memorandum, Trump isn't just abandoning Ukraine, he is providing a direct roadmap for rapid global nuclear proliferation.
The stakes literally could not be higher, and the systemic lies we are seeing from both Moscow and domestic political figures here are deliberately designed to obscure that exact reality from the public.
If this reporting is useful to you, and if you want to help us continue exposing the corruption and the fiction shaping our world, the way you support us is simple. We're the movement. Go to impeach47.earth and get your hats, shirts, and stickers. Become a walking billboard in your community and keep this independent, unfiltered research fed. You can also follow the movement on X at impeach47, on Threads at impeach.47, and on Instagram at impeach.47. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the truth.